Hi, and welcome back for our next module. The next philosopher we're going to meet is the famous Immanuel Kant, considered by many to be the greatest philosopher in Western philosophy in the modern era. He's going to be a little bit of a movement away from the classicist tradition that we spent a lot of time in, the tradition that it was made famous by the Greek philosophers and then picked up by the likes of Anselm and Aquinas. Kant is going to exist during the Enlightenment period. It's going to question a lot of the traditionally held beliefs. And what we're going to see in Kant is actually a shift from the idea of metaphysics, which is the understanding of the nature of reality, to epistemology, which is the understanding of the nature of knowledge, or how do we gain knowledge. One of the reasons for that is the main point really of this module of how does Kant understand metaphysics, the nature of reality. And the answer to that is going to be, well, the nature of reality is going to be influenced and affected by how we understand reality, how we interpret it through our minds. And so for Kant, the question of how do we create knowledge in our minds is going to actually be even more important. So the short answer to this module is, how does Kant view metaphysics? Well, our minds change our perspective and interpret that nature differently. It's really going to be through that lens of our mind that affects how we see reality. So our mind, or what he's and its effect on reality, and what he calls transcendental idealism, is going to be the key concept of what we're going to talk about this module. So let's first meet Immanuel Kant and talk a little bit about who he was. He was born in Königsberg, Prussia, in modern-day Kaliningrad, Russia, in 1724. And would later die in the early 1800s. As I mentioned before, he's considered one of the greatest philosophers of modern Western philosophy, mainly because of his approach to critiquing and understanding philosophical problems. He studied classicism, as probably would have been typical of the day, as the classical school of philosophy was the norm, and he studied it at the Collegium Fredericianum before he moved to the University of Königsberg. While he's there, he began teaching metaphysics and logic, and it's while he's teaching there that he starts to develop the ideas that would make him famous. And he would write them throughout three critiques: one of pure reason, one of practical reason, and one of the power of judgment. His critique of pure reason is what we're going to be referring to today, and that you're going to be asked to read a portion of. Really, what puts him on the map is his ultimate approach to philosophy. He thought it would be more important for us to critique our own mental abilities rather than the world around us. Why? Because at that time, it was to understand the world around us, the idea of the truths and the forms and our experiences of the world. But for Kant, he would say, well, we only ever understand things through our own interpretation, through our minds. And so if we're looking at a situation through a glass, through a lens, if we were to say that lens is our mind and understanding, then our understanding of that situation is only as good as the lens we're seeing it through, which is our mental abilities. So we have to understand the thought processes that affect how we make sense of things. We should question everything that we know. That was a pretty important marker of the Enlightenment period. We should understand the limits of our own knowledge, not to think that we know everything, but to kind of understand that there's a limitation to what we know, because what we know can only be interpreted through our minds. We're only as good as our minds, and our minds are limited. So this might come out in a situation where you and a friend experience the same exact situation, but your understanding of what happened, or your perspective on what happened, are vastly different. Now, there's something that is true about that situation, about what happened. But the fact that you both have two different perspectives on the same thing that happened points to what Kant is talking about how our thought processes and our interpretations affect our understanding of reality. So in this regard, he's speaking to metaphysics, which is the study of the nature of reality. But it's going to quickly turn towards epistemology, the study of the nature of knowledge. In other words, our understanding of reality, of a situation, of what happens, is only as good as our ability to interpret it with our minds, our ability to create knowledge of what happens. So, as I mentioned, he is pretty much a very famous focal point within the Enlightenment period, which took place between the 17th and 18th centuries. He's writing towards the end of this period, the of this period of time. The Enlightenment period, as the name denotes, is alluding to a period of time where human intellect is seen as the highest standard, as the gold standard. There's this rather than trusting in the traditional belief systems and values and methods, there's this new focus on the human intellect and the use of human intellect in order to understand and solve things that are presented to the human intellect, as opposed to the classicist philosophical tradition. The human mind, by things such as the scientific method, can come to understand all. Reason, intellect are the measures of the day. Things that might have been accepted to be true and not tested are now questioned. So these are going to be kind of key markers of the Enlightenment period. And so we have movements such as skepticism or rationalism that are going to evolve in the Enlightenment period. And we'll talk a little bit more about them when we get into the section on epistemology. Well, Kant is entering into this Enlightenment period that's already underway, and he's going to be influenced by a couple of philosophical schools of thought, namely idealism and skepticism. So idealism, also sometimes referred to as essentialism, is going to be the belief that the world is not actually composed of physical things, but of mental ideas. I know that sounds a little weird, but it goes back to the original point I was discussing that's going to be an overarching theme of this module, which is there is reality, but our reality is only as good as our ability to process reality. And our ability to process reality mentally is what idealism is referring to as mental ideas. It's really, is this a physical world, or is it just a bunch of ideas and our ability to process it? It was much of idealism made up much of Western philosophy, especially during this Enlightenment period. And we see it affecting individuals taking from individuals from Plato through Francisco Suarez and Descartes, and that these philosophers thought the most fundamental aspects of reality was the things, such as essence or forms or ideas. What is real is thought or logic or the essence of things, not the things themselves. So Plato even alludes to this in the sense of the cave. We're moving out of perception and after the forms, but we may not ever get to the forms. But we know the forms, those universals, exist. So we're trying to make it this quest for wisdom of freeing ourselves from our interpretations of things. Remember the shadows on the wall, and we're trying to figure out what the shadows are and interpreting them. We're trying to free ourselves from that mental murkiness of how we interpret reality to find reality itself. Well, the philosopher David Hume, who is going to be associated with the skepticism school of thought, responds to idealism in particular and says that we have no reason to believe that the things that we see have any relation to the things that we think or the systems of ideas that we hold, mainly because our senses are not reliable. So we can't say that just because we see a situation, that what we see of that situation is truly the situation, because the two are separate. And even more so, we can't trust our interpretation of the situation that's happening. So Kant is going to have a little bit of a crisis with this, with what Hume says. He's going to be an idealist, and Hume is going to come along, and it's going to give him an issue. Well, how do I handle this? Well, in order to understand what's going to be known as Kant's transcendental idealism, or his take on idealism to respond to Hume, we have to understand two key concepts to Kant's philosophy: the phenomena and the noumena. Phenomena are things we experience and are interpreted from our minds. They can be observed to exist or happen. They're filtered through our mental categories of time and space, how we understand things that are happening around us. So we do not directly encounter them. So you have to think of phenomena as our mind's ability to interpret what we experience. Noumena are the things that exist regardless of our mind's interpretations. They're universals. Uh, but because we can only ever understand things through our minds and they're beyond human experience, in other words, they're transcendent, we can never fully know them. It's not to say that they don't exist, but because they're too far beyond the reaches of human experience, beyond the reaches of phenomena, we can't get to them. So because we can't get to them, we can't fully know or understand them. And any kind of glimpses of the noumena we have are interpreted as phenomena. They're only able to be understood as we experience them. So in that regard, what of the noumena we do experience is unique to us as individuals. It's unique to how our mind interprets the noumena as phenomena, if we even get to the noumena. So Kant would put us humans and our experiences of the world within phenomena. And so in this way, metaphysics can only really be understood within the realm of phenomena. If metaphysics is our understanding of the world around us and our experience of reality, Kant would say our experience of reality is a series of phenomena. Noumena, in as much as that's part of reality, Kant is going to say we're never going to be able to understand. He would put God in the category of the noumena. God transcends human experience, and so as a result, we can never fully know God. God's going to be a big question mark for Kant. It's not to say that God is impossible, but so much as God, at least for Kant, God is going to be an issue for us to be able to experience and to know. He thinks these things, like I said, these things still exist, but not in the way that we exist or that sensible things exist. This is more of a function of failure of our mind's ability to understand them. In other words, just because we can't process or interpret the noumena doesn't mean the noumena isn't real. However, we're limited to the phenomena, so we just have to work within that and accept that. This leads to Kant's understanding of transcendental idealism. He has this little bit of crisis of faith when he reads Hume's critique of idealism. And so his response to Hume is essentially that things really do exist. There is an external reality, there is a noumena. But we can't be sure of our understanding of the noumena. Rather, all our knowledge is mediated by our mental interpretation of phenomena and the categories such as time and space that our mind uses to interpret these experiences of reality. So what do we mean by that? It means whenever we experience reality, our mind takes our experience and categorizes it into certain categories, such as time and space. So we cannot be certain that our experiences of things are how they really are. Remember that example I gave to you before. A situation happens between you and a friend, and you and your friend both interpret that situation differently. Well, who's right? What Kant is going to get at is that our interpretation of the situation colors our understanding of the situation. And so until we realize that limitedness of our ability to understand what happened because of our perspective, we may not fully ever know what truly happened because we'll only be able to see it through our eyes. Now, in a larger question in terms of the quest of wisdom, this goes to show you how important the gaining of various perspectives to a situation are in the quest of wisdom. So one way of looking at metaphysics through Kant's eyes could be that we need to get varying perspectives from different individuals in order to better understand truth, which would exist somewhere closer in the realm of noumena if we're to understand truth like Plato did, forms, for instance. Um, but Kant's still going to have issue with that because everyone's only ever going to see things as phenomena in their mind through their own lens of understanding. So ultimately, here's going to be the key thing to remember as it relates to metaphysics and Kant, is that Kant claims that our minds contextualize and limit reality. So if metaphysics is our understanding of reality, our minds contextualize and limit reality, and we can't escape these limitations. We will only be able to ever experience reality as interpreted through our minds. And so the question that he's going to put forward is, will we ever be able to know what is real? Will we ever be able to know what reality is? Is metaphysics possible if it's only ever understood through our minds? And if our minds serve as almost like a barrier to reality, can we ever get there to the noumena? And ultimately, he's going to say the noumena reality does exist, but we can't be sure of it. We can't be sure of what reality is. So in other words, his answer to metaphysics is we can't be sure of metaphysics. We can only be sure of our interpretation and the knowledge we gain. And that's his move to epistemology. So let's try to understand a little bit about how he does that. So he does this by establishing a key concept called synthetic a priori knowledge. Now, in a previous module, we very quickly talked about the difference between a priori and a posteriori arguments. In other words, a priori comes from purely reason and theoretical, as opposed to a posteriori comes from the experiences. Well, he's going to compare these two against what he calls analytical judgments or synthetic judgments. Because this idea of the transcendental idealism is going to put forward a question. In other words, how can there be universal truths, oftentimes correlated with the noumena, and how can we understand those truths solely from our experiences, the phenomena, which is going to be particular to each one of us? So if our experiences are all different, how can there ever be a universal truth? Because remember, he's claiming that the noumena does exist. We just may not be fully to understand it because of phenomena. Well, that seems to be a contradiction, because if the phenomena is different to all of us, then that would stand to argue that there is no reality, there is no universal truth. So how does he justify this? Well, he first compares analytical and synthetic judgments. Analytic judgments are those concepts within which is contained the subject. So for example, all squares have four corners. So within that subject is the definition of the concept. So what is a square if not a shape with four corners? So the definition of that concept is the definition of the subject is within that concept. This complete opposite is true for synthetic judgments. So the concept is not contained within the subject. So all women are happy. Well, happiness is not a defining term of woman, or of men for that matter. But four corners is a defining term of square. And then he compared a priori and a posteriori propositions. So a priori, the knowledge and its justification are rooted purely in reason, and they do not rely on experience, as opposed to a posteriori, which the knowledge and justification for it that we have relies on experience and is rooted in our sensations from encountering the world around us, our sense of smell, touch, sight. I mean, that's how we understand the world. We're limited to our ability to see, touch, taste. We can't interact with the world beyond our senses. And so how do we justify that there are universals that just are when we're limited by understanding the world through our sight, senses, and tastes, and hearing. So Kant says it is possible for knowledge to be synthetic and a priori. So all a priori knowledge is analytical. Because to say that the concept is contained within the subject is to say that it's purely rational, purely universal. Likewise, to say that the concept is not contained within the subject is to say that knowledge is only known through experience. So a posteriori is synthetic, a priori is analytic. Kant is trying to say that it can be synthetic and a priori. And this is how he puts it forward, that you can know something to be universal without it being self-evident. And the key to this is that categories piece that I talked about. That when we experience phenomena and we take in from our senses of that of our experience of that situation, our mind takes that information that we experience of that reality and classifies it into categories such as time and space, and that these categories become features of experience that are universal and necessary. In other words, the manner in which we process our experiences are universal in and of themselves. The faculties or the categories we use to process our experience are universal. And so, because of that, because the processes to interpret experience are universal, you can have synthetic a priori knowledge. You can have knowledge that is universal, drawn from experiences. So he uses the example of how do we know causation is real? In other words, that everything has a cause. Kind of goes back to Aquinas's second argument. How do we know that everything has a cause when we can't experience it with our senses? And so he's going to put forward that causation, it's not that our minds are looking for causation, it's so much that our minds cannot not find causation in nature, because causation is one of those categories. Our minds are always looking for causes in our experiences, because causes is just one of those a priori cognitive faculties in our mind. Causation is one of the ways that our mind categorizes our experiences. And so because of that, causation is universal. So his response to how can we justify universal truths with experience is going to be different for everyone, is that the way we process our experiences is going to be through universal categories that are just built into our minds. So example of these categories or faculties that he speaks about is time and space. Time and space are the mental categories through which we process all things that we come to know in some way. We come to know them spatially and over time. Since all experience must be filtered by these cognitive faculties or categories, our knowledge is never direct or pure. In other words, our knowledge of an experience, it can only ever be our perception of that experience, because it's always contingent on these categories, on these faculties. However, these cognitive faculties do not create the senses of experiences, because we are taking in information. In other words, we really do experience reality, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to have an experience in order to interpret. So reality is real. We are experiencing it. It's just that our experience of it is being colored by the way we interpret it, by our perspective. These faculties he considers a priori faculties. In other words, they're universal. Time, space, causation, they always exist. These cognitive faculties are what make his philosophy a transcendental idealism. In other words, while our perception of that experience may be different for each one of us, the way in the faculties and the categories within which we process that experience are universal. So the ultimate question for Kant is metaphysics possible? If our perception of reality is just that, perception, can we ever really know what the nature of reality is? And for him, it's going to depend on a priori knowledge. Because a priori knowledge's domain is pure reason, again, we can gain a priori knowledge, we can get to the noumena, perhaps, but only through the phenomena, only through our experience. Synthetic a priori knowledge is still rooted in sense experience. It's filtered through a priori cognitive faculties. So, is it possible in the future to come to know reality? Possibly, but we'll never fully know, and that's a frustrating thing. We can only ever know what we interpret of reality through our experiences. So ultimately, Kant's answer is going to be we can come to know phenomena, and we'll only ever know the noumena through phenomena. But because of that, we will probably never know the noumena. We'll only ever know phenomena. But he points to that there is that possibility in that relationship. On page 137, in your version of his reading of the Critique of Reason, he gives this example of someone building a house and knowing whether or not it will fall. He says, so one says of someone who undermined the foundation of his house that he could have not known through pure reason, a priori, that it would collapse. He needed not have waited for the experience of it actually collapsing to know that it would collapse. Yet he could not have known this entirely through pure reason, a priori. For that bodies are heavy and hence fall if their support is taken away must first have become known to him through experience. In other words, how does someone know that if the foundation of a house has been damaged, that the house is going to fall? Well, he says it's going to be a universal that if you know the foundation of a house is damaged, it will fall. But he says you got to that universal information through experience. There was probably some point in your life where you saw something really heavy fall over because it was too heavy. And because you had that experience, now that you see a poorly formed foundation under a heavy house, you're going to say, it's going to fall. It's already known that it's going to fall. So again, this goes back to that idea of synthetic a priori knowledge, that it is possible, because those categories are all universal, to come to knowledge, to know things to be true, but everything ultimately is going to be from our experiences. Even a universal that we hold to be true, that a house will collapse if its foundation is weak, Kant is going to argue that you came to know that because you had a previous experience that taught you that. So ultimately, everything can only be known to us as humans through experience, through the phenomena. And so in this regard, metaphysics can be thought to be possible, but not really pure metaphysics. Metaphysics is only possible as long as it's derived from experience. So our understanding of reality, aka metaphysics, can really only ever be understood within the realm of phenomena, our experience of reality. That experience is going to be colored because it's going to be dependent on our mind's ability to process it, and be left to interpretation. That's why some will say, is any of this really real, or is it just all in our minds? And Kant is going to say, yes, it is real, but our mind's ability to process reality is really going to color our ability to know it. And so we might not ever really be able to fully understand reality. And so those things that are part of this external reality, the noumena, such as God, he's going to say, probably real, but we'll probably never know. We can only know our experiences of this world. So that is Kant and a brief overview of his noumena, and transcendental idealism. So now I'm going to invite you to complete the rest of the videos and materials in this module.